George. So let me introduce Dr. Chris Lowe. He is going to be our speaker tonight. He's from CSU Long Beach, right? And also has been studying sharks for quite some time. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here. Is that full screen or presenter mode?
There you go. Now you're on full screen.
Perfect. So thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing on white sharks, probably for 15 years now in Southern California. And I got to tell you, I've been in California for over 30 years, and I honestly never thought I would see a day where we see white sharks. I could see white sharks any day of the year in California. I never thought I would see that. So that's kind of what this story I'm going to tell you tonight is about. And it's an interesting new phenomenon. So, it used to be you would show people a picture like this, and I would ask them, well, what would you think about this situation? How comfortable would you be? And a lot of people would say, I don't know if I'd feel very comfortable about, being that close to a white shark, even if it's juvenile. So, but what I can tell you is, in most cases, people either don't know the sharks are there, and we do know now, or if they do see the sharks, they actually aren't as worried about them as they used to be. And I think a lot of that has been based on what we're learning. So in the beginning, this was our image of Jaws, right? And then, of course, the media has twisted it to all sorts of crazy things. And we all know that this isn't actually real. But there is a part of the public who do have a tendency to still buy into the hype about white sharks. So a lot of what we've been focusing on is dispelling a lot of these myths. So first of all, I think the important thing is people have to remember that the white shark population's probably been depressed in California for over 100 years. They were heavily fished up to 1994 when they were protected in state waters. So up to that point, chances are if you ate fish tacos in California prior to 1994, chances are you ate white shark and you didn't know it. If I put a white shark steak and a mako shark steak in front of you, you couldn't tell the difference. So the bottom line is they were fished pretty heavily as juveniles. In addition, the adult food source, which included seals, sea lions, dolphins, whales, were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. So many of those populations have also been depressed, and they didn't receive protection until the 70s. So what happens is we think the white shark population turned the corner in the 90s with protection because their food source came back. They were protected. They were no longer being landed. And in addition, stingrays, which tends to be an important food base for the juveniles, also increased because many of the sea lions that fed on stingrays were gone. So this has allowed the white shark population to recover in the last 20 years. So there are a lot of key things that were done that allowed for this conservation to work. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is our National Fisheries Management Act, California protection of white sharks, banning of nearshore gill nets was actually instrumental in reducing bycatch of white sharks and many other species of sharks in coastal waters. And then, of course, the California Marine Life Protection Act. So all these things were kind of instrumental in allowing white sharks, a top predator in the California coast, to come back. So I say more white sharks, yay, conservation success. Not everybody cheered with me, though. So one of the things that we've noted working with ocean lifeguards across California is in the last 10 years, they've seen a 5-fold increase in white sharks being spotted along the California coast. And a lot of that is particularly concerning for lifeguards because these are at public beaches. In addition, you have to remember we have one of the most heavily populated coastlines in the world in Southern California, with 20 million people accessible to the ocean and enjoying year-round ocean activity. So that includes things like surfing, swimming, stand-up paddleboarding, bodyboarding, wading, and those activities have increased in popularity over time. And in addition, you have to remember that ocean recreation is $1 billion industry in California alone. So it is a really important part, not just of our lifestyle, but our culture. So when we look at places like Santa Monica Bay in the summer, you can have tens of thousands of people in the water, potentially in and amongst white sharks. So in the early days, and when I say the early days of population recovery, this is about 10 years ago, if a white shark was sighted along a beach, the beach was closed, even if that was a juvenile. So the lifeguards were very concerned about that. Because of their reputation, they would pull people out of the water. And they've seen an increase in closures starting about 10 years ago, but have recently decreased. And a lot of it has to do with the new things that we're learning about these sharks. So while we have more sharks in our coastal waters and more people are using the water than ever before, what we aren't seeing is a big increase in bites on people. And believe it or not, the per capita bite rate is decreasing. So over the last 50 years, the per capita bite rate has gone down, which means clearly we are not on the menu. And if bites do occur on people, they're pretty rare. Nonetheless, when bites do occur, they get a lot of media attention, as you probably recognize from this week and last week. So that has economic impacts to coastal communities, even though it is such a rare sort of event. So we've been working with ocean lifeguards for the last 10 to 15 years on what do they do about this issue of white sharks off their beaches. And more importantly, they're asking questions like, when do we need to pull people out of the water? Is it safe for people to be in the water in and amongst these sharks? And to be honest, we didn't really have the answers. So in 2018, we co-authored a bill with Assembly Member Patrick O'Donnell, and we received state funding from the state of California that came to the Shark Lab to develop the California Shark Beach Safety Program. And that program brought $3.75 million to the university to bolster our research, education, and outreach program that was focused primarily on white sharks. So we were able to do this in collaboration with all the ocean lifeguards in California. So some of the things that we've learned over this time period about the distribution of white sharks has kind of expanded this knowledge. So for example, we know that offshore, around the offshore islands and around the central California coast, we typically is where we see the adults. So these are adult white sharks. They're around those islands primarily to feed on northern elephant seals. That's their favorite. So they tend to aggregate around those rookery sites. Males start showing up at the end of August, and they will hang out through the winter until the elephant seals leave, and then they make an open ocean migration out towards Hawaii. Females do the exact same thing, but they return about every other year in about April to give birth to young. And then those young primarily hang out along the Southern California beaches. So that's predominantly where we see white sharks in Southern California. Our juveniles are along the beaches, adults around the offshore islands in the Central California coast. So juveniles are typically spring. So this is the beginning of what we call pupping season. So now we start seeing newborns showing up at beaches. We don't know where birthing occurs. We just know the small ones start showing up starting around March, April, May, and pupping will continue into the summer. So that's when we start to see sharks very, very close to shore. And most of these sharks range anywhere from about 4.5 feet long, which is the size at birth, to about 9 feet long, where they're still considered juveniles. So the question we get most often is, why are the sharks so close to the beach? And we have 3 hypotheses to explain this. Hypothesis number 1, females give birth somewhere, we don't know where, and those young sharks show up. And we think they choose the beaches because the shallow water offers them a safe place. They don't know they're a white shark yet. So this is a safe place for them to hang out while they're learning, hopefully from some other brothers, sisters, cousins. And while they're hanging out in these shallow areas that are safer, it's interesting to note that the water is significantly warmer right along the shoreline than it is a couple hundred yards offshore, further offshore. So now they have a warm water habitat plus a safe habitat, and they'll spend weeks to months in these beaches, which means they have to have an adequate food supply. And because they're completely naive and they get no training from mom, they have to learn to feed on their own. And the most abundant food source that's easy to capture for them are stingrays. And of course, we refer to them as pancakes, but round stingrays are really the predominant thing that the youngest ones start to feed on. They'll feed on bat rays and some other species, and I'll talk more about diet and what we've learned about that. So really, the 3 reasons they're there is safety, warmth, and food. So one of the questions, or one of the phenomena that we see, is that these sharks form aggregations. They'll form groups, and an aggregation is consisting of 5 or more individuals that are using a space within a constricted area for a prolonged period of time. And this is what makes this a nursery. So a nursery is defined as an area where sharks will hang out, and then basically they'll be in this group, but they won't be right next to each other, and they'll use that area for prolonged periods of time. In addition, these aggregations probably are focused on habitat, what temperature of water is there, whether they're the right sand, rock conditions to support that, and food supply. So these aggregations can be up to 40 individuals. Those are the most we've seen at a single aggregation site in a single day is 40 different individuals. And to give you an example what that looks like, these are 10 individuals that were spotted, or 9 individuals in an area the size of a football field, and all of them are around the same size. There's probably about 2 or 3 age classes in there. So a bunch of young of the year, sharks less than 1 year old, some 1 year olds and some 2 year olds in this photo. And it gives you an idea of what these aggregations look like. So to answer questions about why are they coming to these beaches, how much time they're spending at these beaches, what are they doing at these beaches, and what the lifeguards want to know is when are they going to leave these beaches? To answer those questions, we use a variety of technologies in the Shark Lab. So one type we use are called spot tags. So spot tags, if we catch the shark, can get affixed to the shark's dorsal fin, and it's a powerful radio transmitter. So every time the fin breaks the surface, it's transmitting to satellites in orbit, and then it sends me an email with a lat long time, date, and ID of that shark. Now, because sharks aren't marine mammals, they don't have to come to the surface to breathe. We don't always get a lot of data from individuals. Some individuals spend more time at the surface than others. So if we want to collect more data and we want to know how deep they go, we use these other kinds of transmitters called pop-off archiving satellite transmitters. Now, these get darted into the shark's back. They've got a temperature, light, and depth sensor, and they're recording to a little computer in that device every 30 seconds. And then at a pre-described time and date, this thing pops off the animal, floats up to the surface where it uploads all that data to the satellite, and then it downloads it all to me and sends me an email with all that information. We get a really accurate record of the temperature and the depth of the water that that shark moved through. Now, the geoposition estimate isn't very good. In other words, the shark could either be somewhere off Huntington Beach or it could be in Compton. So we can't use that to know how close they get to beaches. But this other technology called acoustic telemetry, which is something the Shark Lab is known for, if we catch the shark, we can invert the shark and we can surgically implant one of these transmitters into the body cavity. And that transmitter has a 10-year battery life. It uses ultrasonic ping, and that ping travels really well through seawater. And then we have about 100 of these underwater acoustic receivers all along Southern California beaches that are constantly listening for tagged sharks. So when a tagged shark gets within about 300 yards of one of these receivers, the receiver will log the time, the date, and the ID number. Now, some of those transmitters have depth and temperature sensors in them, so we can get the temperature and the depth at the location where the shark is detected. Now, some of the sharks are a little too big for us to catch and surgically implant, so we can actually dart one of these transmitters into the shark's back as well. Now, the fourth type of technology are what we call smart tags, and smart tags or think of them like a Fitbit for sharks. So they give us really high resolution data about what that shark is doing for a day. And I'll talk more about these types of technologies in a few minutes. So as you can see, we've tagged quite a few sharks. We have about 235 sharks swimming around right now with active acoustic transmitters. So in order to get this bling on these sharks, we use a variety of capture methods. One method we use is that we work with commercial fishers. And if commercial fishers are catching sharks offshore where they're allowed to gill net, they'll bring those sharks back to us sometimes. And then we can take measurements, tissue samples, blood. We can fit them with all these different types of transmitters, take them out, release them, and then track their movements. In some cases, we can either use drones, helicopters, or fixed wing planes to get up close to the sharks and then tag the sharks. We can dart a transmitter or a pat tag in their back. And we can use this image and the size of the boat to estimate the size of the shark. We can dip a camera underneath so we can identify as whether it's a male or a female. So here you can see examples of what we call jab tagging. And then one other method we use, if the water's clear and there are no other animals around, in some cases, we can put a piece of gill net right in front of the shark that we're tracking, entangle that shark, and then we can process it just like we would if we got it from a commercial fisher. So by using these techniques, over the last 10 years, we've tagged over 300 juvenile white sharks using this technology. All right, so now I'm going to show you some tracks that are based on the pop-off satellite tags and the geolocation, but these give us an idea of their migratory patterns. So what I'm going to show you is a track from a shark that was caught off Ventura in 2007. And what you're going to see here is a date counter. This is time and date, and this is going to show you the water temperature. It's in degrees C. But just think of blue as being cold and red as being warm. So what you're going to see here is all summer long, the shark is hanging out somewhere off a Southern California beach, and its location is somewhere in this black smudge. And then as the water temperature starts to drop around October, November, you see this green-blue water come in. That is a cue that drives this migration south. So prior to 2015, pretty much every small white shark that we tagged exhibited this behavior. They all migrated down to this area around Vizcaíno Bay. But in 2007, we had an opportunity to do a really cool experiment. So this second small white shark that was caught off Ventura was actually taken up to Monterey Bay Aquarium and kept in their open ocean exhibit for 5 months. And that shark gained 100 pounds in 5 months. It was the best fed shark in the entire world. And the aquarium was getting a little nervous because it was eyeing a lot of its tank mates. In fact, it was eating some of the other sharks in the tank, and it was starting to jump. So they became very nervous about being able to catch and release it safely. So they did catch it from the tank. They released it in Monterey in February. Anybody want to take a guess how cold the water is in February in Monterey? So now what you're going to see is this track, and you can tell that baby white sharks do not like cold water. In fact, that shark had to go all the way to Mazatlan to warm up. And what's really cool here is you'll see, and this happens every spring, slugs of hot water get pushed up from the equator into the Gulf of California. And what's happening is you can see it's actually pushing the shark into the Gulf. Right before that tag was scheduled to pop off, the shark started hanging out at about 150 feet where the water temperature was about 62 degrees. Surface water temperature in the Gulf, 82 degrees. So what this clearly shows is that these sharks don't like water too warm and they don't like water too cold. So the small ones, even though white sharks are endothermic, which means as long as they're swimming, they can keep their body core warmer than the water. But the babies are so small, they don't do a good job at keeping the heat. So as a result, they kind of act like a cold-bodied shark, like a blue shark. So they're much more temperature sensitive. So here are acoustic receivers. These show all the locations. We have about 100 spread from Morro Bay all the way down to the Mexican border. And this technology is shared by other researchers, which means they have receivers out tracking other species. So we can share data. If they get detections of my sharks, they'll give me the data. And if I detect there are other animals on my array, I share that with them. And there are researchers that use this technology from Alaska all the way down to Central America. So we're all part of the big network who shares this information. So remember, these receivers are underwater receivers. A team of diver has to go out and pick them up. We can download them, put them back, and then they're constantly listening for sharks. So it takes my team about a month to download all these receivers across Southern California. And then every month we provide lifeguards with county-wide information about what sharks were detected off their beaches. So you can see that we have receivers around the Channel Islands, and we're partners with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. They help us maintain this array. We have receivers all around Catalina, and then our partners down at Scripps also have a big array, so we share all this data. So one of the things we've learned from our acoustic tagging and tracking data of those 300 sharks that we've tagged is that these juvenile aggregations form at locations, but they'll break down and then the sharks move other places. So for example, in 2010 to 2012, the main aggregation site was at Will Rogers Beach. And just recently, we found that aggregation has revived. So it was gone. So from 2010 to 2012 was Will Rogers. Then it shifted to Manhattan Beach from 2013 to 2015. And then from 2015 to 2016, it shifted to Belmont Shore and Surfside, Huntington Beach. And then in 2017 to 2018, it shifted down to Dana Point and San Clemente. All these other locations were cold. And then in 2018 to now, and then 2019 till now, Del Mar and Carpinteria are becoming larger aggregation sites. And the aggregation sites are increasing in number. So what we're seeing are more sharks and the aggregation sites increasing. So right now, we just now are getting a renewed aggregation site forming in Santa Monica Bay. So that means there are more sharks. And what we're noticing is that as they get bigger and older, they start hanging out at the same beaches, much like they did when they were babies, and that number is increasing. So one of the challenges that the lifeguards have is that they have to wait every month to get data from us. So we would say, okay, by the way, 2 weeks ago, there was an 8-foot white shark off your beach. And they would go, thank you, but that's not very helpful. Can we get data faster? So working with a telemetry manufacturer, we've developed these buoys that have a receiver, a cabled receiver right underneath the buoy. So now if a tagged shark swims within 300 yards of a buoy that's anchored 200 yards off the beach, instead of a diver having to pick it up, this thing has a cell modem. It sends a text alert to lifeguards. And that text alert gives them that information about what shark was just detected. So they can use that information to track the behavior and movements of shark activity off their beach in real time. Some of those transmitters have depth data or temperature data. And in addition, those buoys also gather environmental data. So as a result, they get all this information. And right now, only lifeguards and scientists have access to these data, but we're thinking about in the next 2 years, making these data publicly available. So this is the website that text alert takes lifeguards to. Here are the buoys, and red buoys mean that's offline, it's not working. A white buoy means no detections that day. Green buoys mean there were detections that day. This gives them a summary by location. And then each one of these tiles that you see is like a baseball card for a shark. So for example, BR is a bat ray. So we tag white shark food as well. We want to see where those are going. WS is a white shark. Here you can see that this is the last time it was detected, and it's in 16.4 degrees C water, and it's 1.8 meters below the surface. So all this information helps lifeguards understand patterns. Now, if they want to know where that individual has been, they can click on that, and then that will give them the stats on that shark. It's a female, it was 2.13 meters, and then they'll actually get all the locations where that shark has been detected over time. So using this information, the lifeguards don't use this as an early warning system. They use it to understand patterns of behavior. And by using this, they've actually reduced the number of beach closures. So for example, they may know that there's an 8-foot white shark that's been out off their beach, detected every single day, every hour for weeks or months at a time, and nobody's seen that shark. So why close a beach? So they're actually using that to help them improve how they manage beaches. Now they post signs to warn people that this is shark habitat and that sharks are in the area, but they don't actually pull people out of the water. And that, we believe, has saved some of these cities and counties millions of dollars in lost revenue from beach closures. So if we really want to know what these sharks are doing on a finer scale, we're able to use those same acoustic receivers to track and get positions of individuals. So one of my graduate students, Emily Spurgeon, did this project at Carpinteria where we had a big aggregation of sharks. So this is that area, and here's the Carpinteria marsh, and there's a reef right out here, which is the carp reef. And then we have a big aggregation of sharks that we've been tagging. So each one of these white dots you see is an acoustic receiver. And because they're in a grid, if a shark is detected by 3 or more receivers at a time, we can actually triangulate a position of where that transmitter was at the time that it pulsed. So by using that, we get an actual position, a time and date. So Emily went out and we got 2.5 million detections between May 15th and December 9th in 2020. Each color you see is a different individual shark. And what you're actually doing is watching them move along this beach. This is only 6 days worth of data. So we have months and months of data showing these sharks kind of hanging out. And you'll notice that they're using certain beaches at certain times. And it turns out that a lot of that pattern of behavior is tied to water temperature. So this area is very dynamic in its water temperature. So in those 8 months, we got 270,000 positions that we could use to analyze and ask how close are sharks to each other, how close are they to the beach, and then what water temperatures are they in. So it's really given us the ability to begin to understand how sharks are making decisions when they're at these sites. So in 2021, we got the same number, a lot more sharks tagged. We had sharks that returned, and then we could use that information to begin to understand how they're making decisions and how they socialize. So one of the things we want to know is, so we know they're using the same beaches over and over again. They're basically moving back and forth along these beaches, spending weeks to months there. Some individuals are coming, some individuals are going. We're always tagging new sharks at these sites. They're shuffling between aggregation sites to a certain degree. But if we want to know what they're doing during a day, we want to get higher resolution data, we use these devices, what we call smart tags. So think of a smart tag like a Fitbit for a shark. It's got a 3D accelerometer, 3D gyroscope, 3D magnetometer, temperature and depth sensor. So we're measuring every motion the shark is making 30 times a second. It's in this little backpack that gets clamped onto the shark's dorsal fin. This has also got a video logger that points down the shark's nose so we can see what the shark sees. So when the shark is chasing something, we see a rapid acceleration. We can see, is it chasing a stingray or is it getting chased by something else? So by using this information, we get a really high resolution idea of what that shark's doing that day. So there's a galvanic release. So after 24 hours, this thing pops off, floats up to the surface. We can go find it, download it, just like you would your Fitbit. And we can calculate how fast that shark was swimming, water temperature that it moved through, all those sorts of things. So there's a radio transmitter that enables us to get it back. So these specialized tags cost between $10,000 and $20,000 a piece, but we can get them back, rebattery them, recharge them, and reuse them. So to give you an idea, we tracked 3 juvenile white sharks off Belmont Shore a few years ago when the aggregation was here. And to give you an idea what we get. So here's a track. This is Naples right here. So these are the movements of the sharks relative to depth. So red is near when it's near the surface. Blue is when it's near the bottom. This is the compass heading that we get from the magnetometer. OBDA stands for overall body acceleration. So think of this as a total activity. So when you get red, the shark is being very active. And when you get blue, it's being inactive. So what you'll notice is the place where it's being inactive is where it was deepest. And the place where it was most active was when it was near the surface. We can also measure its tail beat amplitude, tail beat frequency, so we can even calculate to a certain degree its swimming speed and its metabolic consumption. So by doing this, this is literally like a Fitbit for sharks. Now, for 2 of the 3 sharks we tracked using the smart tag, we get some really bizarre data. One of the things we found was the sharks were swimming in a 30-foot diameter circle in a bank like a plane, so at like a 45-degree angle, like a plane. And they would swim in a circle for 20 minutes in one direction. And then they would reverse and go the opposite direction for 20 minutes. And then they would reverse again. And they would do this pattern for 4 hours. 2 of the 3 sharks we tracked exhibited this pattern for about 4 hours. And we could not really figure out what was going on, why the sharks doing this. So my grad students actually were looking in the literature, and it turns out scientists had put little EEG caps on migratory birds that continuously fly when they migrate. And what they found was those birds will turn off half their brain and will fly in a circle in one direction, then turn off the other half of their brain and fly in a circle in the other direction. And basically, this is how a bird that continuously flies while it migrates sleeps. So we know whales and dolphins exhibit what we call unihemispheric sleep. They'll do the same thing. They'll turn off half their brain while the other half is active. White sharks are what we call obligate ram ventilators, which means they must keep their mouths open. They must swim through the water in order to get enough water across their gills to breathe. So we believe this is the first time anybody's demonstrated how a white shark may actually sleep or rest. So because we get such high resolution data, we're able to see this pattern for the very first time. So the next question we wanted to answer, and this is the one the lifeguards really want to know the answer to, is how often are sharks near people? So to answer this question, what we used were drones. So my grad student, Patrick Rex, went out and flew drone surveys along 26 beaches every month for 2 years. And then he used these drone surveys to measure the distance of waders, swimmers, surfers, stand-up paddleboarders, and then measure their distance from the shoreline and from the wave break, and then their distance from any sharks that were spotted. So here you can see a variety of videos of juvenile white sharks basically swimming right by people in the water. And he has hundreds of hours of this. So to give you an idea, Patrick flew, actually it was over 700 surveys and ended up with about 700 hours of footage covering 145 kilometers of Southern California coastline. And essentially what he found was that at aggregation sites, he saw a white shark near a person 97% of the days that he surveyed. So at aggregation sites, there are constantly sharks near people. And quite often, he noted from the video that the surfers or swimmers never could see the sharks. They were there. They didn't know the sharks were actually there. So it's really this information that has kind of changed our idea of how often sharks and people are together. So to give you an idea what that video survey looks like, here's what he does. He points the drone camera down. He just flies a survey, keeping part of the coastline in the area so he can measure the distance from the wave break and then from the shoreline. And then he had to identify all these objects. Is that a surfer? Is that a swimmer? Is that a bodyboarder? Is that a stand-up paddler? He would identify sharks and seals and dolphins and things like that in the water, and then we could measure the distance. Now, he spent hundreds of hours analyzing these data, so he teamed up with engineers to develop machine learning algorithms that would automatically identify these objects. So I had undergrads that went through and classified 10,000 images so that we could train the software to accurately identify surfers, sharks, and swimmers. And then by using this autonomous system, now we can make these measurements really quickly. In fact, we can provide all the beach cities with a count of how many surfers are off their beach in minutes using this software. So one of the things Patrick found was at Padero Beach up by Carpinteria, the triangles you see are the locations where he spotted sharks. The blue is where he saw water users, whether they're surfers, swimmers, waders. And you'll notice that there's a high overlap between where he saw sharks. The red or circles are the extent at which he saw sharks. So you'll notice that there's a high overlap between where he saw sharks and where he saw people. So based on this, you might assume, well, maybe the sharks are hanging out close to people because they're interested in people. Well, what's really interesting about this is that this is a good habitat for them because the water's warmer. And the only beach access point to this area is right here. So basically, there's one beach access point that occurs at this point. And the other thing that he found from his drone study is that most surfers aren't willing to walk more than 200 yards to find a surf break. So beach access is very important to distribution on a beach. Now, when we compare that to Del Mar, which was the other juvenile aggregation site, we see something really similar, except here the blue is humans, the red is sharks, and the triangles are sharks that he detected. And you'll see that sharks are moving all the way along this beach, all the way up close to Carlsbad, and then back down. But a majority of the shark activity is at this reef that occurs right off Del Mar. So one of the things that's interesting is you'll note that human activity is spread all along Del Mar Beach. And the reason for that is there's 10 beach access points here that allow people to distribute themselves along this area. So basically, the main takeaways that Patrick found was that surfers outside the lineup are the ones that come in closest proximity to juvenile white sharks because that's their distribution. And then waders had the least overlap because they were inside the wash, and juvenile white sharks rarely go in the wash. So basically, he was able, for the very first time anywhere in the world, quantify how often people and sharks are together and how that varies across places like California beaches. So we know that sharks are spending prolonged periods of time at these beaches, weeks to months. And obviously, they have to be eating something there. So what are these sharks eating? And is there enough food there to support them? So to answer this question, I had 3 graduate students working on various aspects of this project. So one was actually trying to figure out what white sharks eat from looking at their chemical signatures in their muscle. So she would take muscle biopsies from these sharks, and then we could compare that chemical signature from their muscle with the various food items that we find in Southern California. So this little video clip I'm going to show you is really cool. So what you're seeing here is a shark. Those are all round stingrays, all those things you see. So basically, there's some bat rays in there, but you can see that's a target-rich environment for these sharks. So that's why we call round stingrays pancakes. There's tons of them. They're easy for the sharks to capture. We have lots of drone footage of the sharks diving down in the sand, grabbing. You'll see stingray tails hanging out of their mouths. So we know they're eating them. So Jamila did this study where she took samples, and we could do beach seines to collect these animals, and we could take muscle biopsies from the prey, and then we could compare their chemical signatures with that of the sharks. And what she found, was that juvenile white sharks, 25% of their diet is comprised of stingrays, small sharks like small leopard sharks, gray smoothhounds, shovel-nosed guitarfish, and about 20% of their diet is made up of flatfish. 14% of their diet is made up of croakers, and then another 14% of their diet is made up of surf perch, and then there's a handful of other species, including a few invertebrates. So by and large, their favorite things to eat are sharks and rays. So the other grad students were looking at how much food is available at aggregation sites compared to non-aggregation sites. In other words, are sharks at these aggregation sites because there's more food? So they used two methods. So Elizabeth used beach seines to count how many fish and stingrays were at aggregation sites and non-aggregation sites. But we knew we couldn't catch everything that sharks might be eating using beach seines. So she used this other technique called BRUVs, which stands for Baited Remote Underwater Video Systems. So this is a frame. There's a video GoPro right here, right? She puts that in the water, and then there's a little bait on the end of a 1 meter long pole. And she can let those cameras run for an hour and a half, and then she can play back that video, and then she can record how many fish of different species she sees go by the camera to figure out what prey are present and in what abundance. And then we can use that to calculate how much biomass of all these different prey are out there. Now, my third grad student, Zach, used a different technique. So what Jamila found, which is really interesting, this is the diet. This is based on the chemical signatures of sharks. She sampled aggregation sharks from Carpinteria and Del Mar, but we also got some sharks from commercial fishermen that were catching them outside 3 miles, where they'd catch them in their gill nets. So when we sampled those sharks that were caught from offshore, one of the things that was really interesting is that it turns out that they're eating different things. So the offshore sharks are eating offshore fish. So they're eating more pelagic fish like sardines, anchovies. They're eating more flatfishes on the bottom that are found more offshore. And then the inshore sharks are feeding things on inshore. And we tagged all these offshore sharks. And one of the things that we noticed was none of these offshore sharks actually went to aggregation sites. So what this indicates is that there are actually two subpopulations of juvenile white sharks off Southern California. There's a group that aggregate and form these social groups, but then there's this group of loners that hang offshore that eat completely different things. So here you can see kind of the composition of the diet by the different groups of sharks that were sampled. So Elizabeth was using beach seines and BRUVs, and the BRUVs, again, was hundreds of hours of video. So she did this at aggregation sites and at non-aggregation sites. So to give you an idea what BRUV footage looks like, so this is a classic white shark selfie. So they'll come in occasionally and we would get shots of that, but mainly we got lots of shots of stingrays and surf perch and croakers and things like that. This is my favorite though. This was off Del Mar. So you got your patrol of dolphins, and then you just got a couple gray whales come through and photobomb. So, and this is in less than 20 feet of water. And then, of course, we also set these on reefs because there are reefs associated with Carpinteria and with Del Mar. And you see different assemblages of fish associated with reefs than you would with sand. So leopard sharks, things like that were more common there. And we know that juvenile white sharks are eating on assemblages of fish, both reef associated and sand associated. So Zach used a different technique. What Zach did was he took water samples at aggregation sites and non-aggregation sites, the same places where Elizabeth did all the beach seining and BRUVs at the exact same time. And by taking a water sample, you basically have a DNA soup. So every animal's DNA has been sloughed off from their cells, it is in that water sample. So you can take a liter of water, you can filter that out, and then you can probe for all those different species DNA. So Zach had species-specific probes. So he would take water samples at 8 stations at each of these 4 sites, 2 aggregation sites, 2 non-aggregation sites. He could filter them out, and then he could extract the DNA and then determine based on genomic techniques what species DNA was present and in what abundance. So one of the things that Zach found was that his pattern matched that of Elizabeth's, but he counted 30% more species at both aggregation and non-aggregation sites than Elizabeth caught or saw with a camera. So we know with eDNA, we get a better idea of how big the potential buffet is for white sharks out there, right? But we also know that at these aggregation sites, so the 2 blue ones are 2 aggregation sites. These are 2 non-aggregation sites. That at the aggregation sites, that the white sharks are actually feeding down the sharks and rays. In other words, they found a significant reduction in sharks and rays at aggregation sites than at non-aggregation sites. And this is the first time anybody's been able to show that sharks actually have a top-down effect on a fish community. So by using these combination of techniques, what we found is that these well-established aggregations are actually feeding down the population or changing the behavior of some of those sharks or rays, and that at non-aggregation sites, those abundances are higher. So what's really interesting is that, remember, Belmont and Surfside had been an aggregation site back in 2015 to 2017, and then it went cold. We haven't detected sharks there since. So what we think is happening is the sharks feed down the food base, and now we expect to see shifting, and that might drive them back, like Will Rogers, for example. So if we know how much prey is available, and we can do that just from a water sample, we may be able to predict where the next aggregation sites are going to form, just based on how much prey DNA is in the water. So our goal is to take this science and get it out to the public. So one of the ways that we do that, and we have a big public outreach branch of the California Shark Beach Safety Program, and our main tool for doing that are what we call Shark Shacks. So these are mobile pop-ups. We do 36 public beaches and piers all summer long. So I have an army of undergrads that are trained to deliver a curriculum, and they go out and they talk to the public about beach safety. We talk about sharks and stingrays and sea jellies and rip currents, and of course the technology that we're using to study these animals so that the public has an understanding of what they might experience when they go to that beach. So in this time, on average, we engage about 12 to 17,000 people a year. In addition, we get our information out to the public using infographics. So I hire Cal State Long Beach artists to work with our marine biology students to develop infographics to help inform and educate the public. And by the way, these are free. So if you'd like some for your dive shop, I'll give you the files. You can print them out. You can post them anywhere you want. The lifeguards are posting these on the back of lifeguard towers. These are all free graphics, and they help explain things like why are there more white sharks off the beach? What is a nursery? What should we expect? And how to be smart when you go in the ocean at the beaches. In addition, I've teamed up with a psychologist who's helping us do studies on people's perceptions of sharks and other wildlife. And one of the things that we're finding is that certain types of messages scare the public. So for example, in Cape Cod, these are the signs that you would find at Cape Cod. So they've actually seen people drive into a parking lot, see this sign, get back in their car and drive away. And the reason for that is, that's a beautiful picture of a white shark, but people relate that to Jaws and Shark Week. However, I tasked an art student with designing one that would educate people about adult white shark aggregations. So they're using art to tell a story. And the goal here is to educate people, but not frighten them. So right now, the cities, particularly up on the Central California coast, are going to start posting these in their parking lots. And the other thing is we find that the art is more appealing. People get sign blind. So which means that if they see a bunch of signs, they stop looking at them. But if the art's appealing, they'll go back and they get different things every time they go back to the sign. So the goal is to really inform and educate the public without scaring them. In addition, we have our own comic book. We have a comic book series. The first one we did is on beach safety, and kids can smell educational information a mile away. So I recruited, again, some art students who are animation artists, and I tasked them with getting our curriculum across. So they had to be able to draw animals that were anatomically correct, that could be identified to species based on their drawings, but the kids or the people could be as cartoonish as you want. And they had to have a demographic that reflected our community, and it could have all the teenage angst you want in there to get kids to read it, but there had to be take-home messages. So this one became so popular, we gave out 20,000 copies in the first year, that we did a second one, which is on marine pollution, to educate kids about marine pollution and what they can do about that. And then we came up with a third one, which is called Shark Spies. So we've given out 50,000 paper copies. We're just printing another, I think, 18,000. I hate the paper copies, but the kids love them. But they're available on the Shark Lab website for free. You can read them just like a comic book on your phone. And we have them in English and in Spanish. So the goal is to make all these things available for free. We want to get that information in kids' hands. So remember I said I teamed up with a psychologist. So I teamed up with Dr. Gabby Hancock, and she's a psychologist, specializes in the study of fear. Turns out she was perfect. So we have been doing online surveys. We have an online survey that we're doing right now, and I'll send you a link that you can share with others. It's a long survey, but it actually is giving us a lot of insight into how people perceive sharks and other marine wildlife. And so far, the data have been very compelling. We've published a couple papers on this. And they're kind of some of the first studies of their kind. Our goal is to use this perception information to know how we should better target different demographics to begin to change their perceptions of the way they think about sharks. In addition, I also teamed up with an ecotourism specialist. This is Dr. Katie Dudley, and she specializes in understanding how you can encourage people to use more outdoor tourism. So what she and her students have been doing is doing interview surveys at beaches, and they're focusing primarily on tourists, asking them, how did you learn about this beach? Why are you coming here? What kind of ocean activities are you going to do? Would you still go in the water if you knew there were white sharks at this beach? So she's in the middle of analyzing all those data, and this is just a word cloud to kind of summarize some of the findings. But what I love about this, on the dislikes, you'll notice that stingrays show up fairly big, which means tourists have been stung by stingrays or know about stingrays. But you'll notice that sharks don't even show up in dislikes. But over here, look how big sharks are. So it actually turns out that there were quite a few people that responded to the survey that knew there were white sharks at the beach that we surveyed them at. And one of the reasons why they went to that beach was they were hoping to see a white shark. So that's really exciting. And the cities were really excited about this data because they were afraid that the news about white sharks at those beaches would scare people away. And actually, there's some evidence that it might actually be luring more people to their community. In addition, every time there's a shark bite and it makes national news, there's always this worry that it's going to affect tourism. There's been no economic studies to look at the economic impacts of shark bites on a community. So I've teamed up with Dr. Didi Long, who's an environmental economist, who's helping us investigate this. So what we're doing is we're looking at the economic situations in communities before, during, and after shark bites to evaluate what is the magnitude of economic impact to a community that could result from a shark bite in the media that follows that. So she's right in the middle again of this data. And the challenging part is California apparently doesn't have very good tourism data. So right now we're finishing off a data set from Hawaii. And what's really interesting from the data set from Hawaii is there are no changes in hotel reservations as a result of nationally information about national, let me get this right. After a shark attack in Hawaii, which makes national news, there's no change in hotel reservations as a result of that. Now, Hawaii is kind of a unique situation because if you already have hotel reservations to go to Hawaii and you have plans to go there, chances are you're not going to change your plans just because you heard about a shark attack, whereas California may be a little different. So right now, we're trying to do the same thing for California. So our next steps are our state funding we've had for 6 years. Runs out in September. And at which case, if I don't find more funding, the program will stop. So right now we're seeking private funding. And then we hope when the state budget comes back, we can get funded again. One of the things that we want to do, particularly before the 2028 Olympics, is to get a Pacific Shark Visitor Center where people can come and learn more about our beaches and beach safety. We've been talking with many of the beach cities. They're very interested about having something like this in their city, but we have to raise money to support it. So these are some of the things we want to do, take it to the next level. And of course, a majority of our funding has come from the state. Hopefully we'll be able to get back on the state funding, but right now we're looking for private money. Monterey Bay Aquarium helped get us started. We had funding from them. Altasia, and we have a number of small private donors. We have lots of research and education collaborators. And of course, we work with every single beach city and county in Southern and Central California. So with that, thank you. And then maybe I can answer some questions.
Thank you, Chris. That was amazing. I have a couple of questions that have come in. I'm wondering if you might have a comment about the Del Mar incident that took place recently.
Yes. So we're still investigating. So I work with a team of state biologists and managers. And right now we're in the process of examining the wetsuit, examining photos, witness accounts. We're running the DNA from the wetsuit right now to confirm species. So that's still being investigated. We hope in the next week we'll have that done. And then once that's done, the state usually will issue a press release about the size, the species, that sort of thing. We've taken water samples, things like that. So we've flown drone surveys. The red tide is really bad there right now, and we suspect that that might have been a contributing factor because visibility is so poor. It's possible that the swimmers even swam into the shark. So we're just trying to look at all those variables, which we do with all incidents in California. We investigate all of them and then try to come back and use that information to give the public ideas on ways that people can be safer.
And
all I can tell you is based on our analysis so far from all the incidents, that there really are no patterns. We still really don't know why sharks occasionally bite people. And at the end of the day, the probabilities are so low that your probability of being injured driving to a dive site on the freeway is so much higher that it's almost crazy we worry about these things.
I wonder if you might comment, it seems like Australia and even times in Hawaii, there's many more incidents of shark bites rather than here. Like you said, we have a huge population that's in the water. They're close to people in the water, and yet we don't even see them.
Right. So, globally, what it really comes down to is size matters, right? So keep in mind, Florida is the shark bite capital of the world. Their average is between 37 and 42 bites per year, but those bites are by reef sharks. They're usually on hands and feet, and they're very minimal in terms of the extent of injuries. Rare, very rare to have fatalities. If fatalities do occur, they're usually related to bull sharks, right? But when you get to California and Hawaii, now you're talking about much bigger sharks. You're talking about white sharks and tiger sharks that get much larger. They have larger dentition. So even small bites from a big shark do considerable more damage. So our bite rates are considerably low. Our average is somewhere between 3 and 4 a year in California, right? In Hawaii, it's a little bit higher. But when you consider how many people are in the water relative to that number, our chances of being bitten in California are substantially lower than that of Florida. So one of the things, we just had a big international conference in South Australia just on white sharks, and all the white shark people got together. And one of the things we did know, and we're working on a study right now, is that California has one of the lowest fatality rates from white shark bites compared to South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And one of the things that we think attribute to that is that we have cell coverage along our entire coast. A majority of the people that have been bitten by white sharks that very easily could have resulted in death were the fact that there was a first responder in the water with them that had first aid training. We have an amazing EMS system. We have 39 trauma centers in Southern California alone, and we have one of the best medevac systems that exist anywhere on the planet. So what we've seen from the last 8 shark bites that have occurred in Southern California is that 3 or 4 of those would have been fatal anywhere else. But the people, from the time they were bitten to the time they were in a trauma center, was less than 35 minutes. And there's nowhere else in the world you can go and find that kind of medical support. So I think that's another really important factor. So bites will occur, but the difference between what should be a horrible, recovery and physical therapy and all those things and death really attributed to the fact that Southern California has a lot of people in the water that have first aid training and know what to do in response. We have a lot of really well-trained lifeguards, excellent medics, medevac, and trauma centers all over the place.
So be well trained in first aid and have maybe the right equipment on hand to come to the aid of someone else. Yeah. And don't go out when the water's really murky and a lot of red tide.
Right. And we do annual training with all the ocean lifeguards. So we have ER doc come in and we talk about trauma training, how to do that, how to respond to shark bites, make sure they have the right equipment. In other words, many of them have tourniquets and they know how to use tourniquets, but we found that many of them don't have combat gauze. These are basic things for an open wound that are a must, right? So now they're re-equipping, they're retraining, they're using some new tools that they hadn't known about before. And of course, the lessons that we've learned in response to these bites are, try to keep sand out of the wound. Whether it's the lifeguards pulling them up on the beach, carry them out of the water, don't drag them across the sand, cover them before the helicopter gets there, because these poor people could spend 8 hours on the operating table just for irrigation to get rid of all the sand. So these are things our lifeguards are learning, and it's making a huge difference in people's recovery and success of recovery from these pretty nasty bites.
Good to know. Why do they group together? I mean, I've always thought of sharks as being kind of solitary. When they're younger, it seems like they group together. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, we don't really know. We're trying to figure that out because they're not like a school, right? They're not like buddy. They're never right next to each other. In fact, when they do get close to each other, they get a little pissy, especially the big ones. The big ones will chase the smaller ones out of the way, or the small ones will move. There's definitely a hierarchy there. And the only thing we can think of is that, because there are other white sharks around, individuals may think that that's a safe place, number one. And number two, that there's adequate food and environmental conditions to warrant other white sharks being there. So it kind of causes these kind of loose aggregations to form. And then we'll see individuals shuffle in and out of those. So that's still a mystery. And one of the things we're looking at, and we have the data to do, are there buddies? In other words, are there individuals that are more likely to be detected together? And are they related? So using genetics, we can actually start to ask those questions. Were they litter mates? Were they part of the same litter? Are they cousins? How do they know? So those are some of the cool technologies that we can now use to answer those questions.
Chris, with all the telemetry data that you have, are those areas of aggregation beyond the food the warmest spots?
They're not, which is interesting, right? So they're warm. They're definitely warmer than many of the other spots. There are some other factors that we think are playing in. Having a reef and sand habitat nearby seems to be really important in terms of supporting those for longer periods of time. Water temperature, I think, is a big one. But there are some warmer spots where we would expect to see aggregations, but we don't. We have receivers there because we keep thinking maybe that, we'll start seeing sharks show up, but we haven't seen that yet. So there's something we're missing. We're missing something.
And when does a juvenile get classified as an adult?
Yeah, so it varies between males and females. So males mature somewhere around 10 feet. And that probably takes them 10 or 11 years to reach that size. Females don't mature until they're about 12 feet long, and they could be anywhere between 12 and 16 years old. So all the sharks we see along our beaches, they're all juveniles. Even the 9-footers, which look really big, are still, think of them as, grade schoolers.
And then where do they go?
That's an interesting question. So by the time they're 6 years old, we see them trying to start to occupy adult habitat. So that's when we see them go out to the offshore islands. We see them go to Monterey. We see them go to Guadalupe, and then they disappear. So last year we tagged a bunch of 9-footers with pop-off satellite tags. And of the 12 that we tagged, 4 of them popped off halfway between here and Hawaii, which means they're starting to do what the adults do.
Interesting. And what about orcas?
Yeah. So the offshores have been known to kill adult white sharks up at the Farallones. We don't know how often that occurs because that was just a rare event that somebody was able to witness and get on camera. But when that happens, the sharks do clear out. We haven't seen that with juveniles, and we think a lot of the aggregations, orcas don't come in that close to shore, especially the offshores, because they're offshore orca pods. But those juvenile white sharks, that second aggregation that hangs out offshore, they might be getting picked off by orcas.
Interesting. And with the warming of the water, do you think we'll see more aggregations, more rebound,
Yeah, we're already seeing. So, for example, in 2015, a new nursery formed up in Santa Cruz, and that aggregation is getting bigger. So, and what's really interesting about that is that the northern part of Monterey Bay has been getting progressively warmer over the last 40 years. So we attribute that to climate change, right? And that's opening up new nursery habitat for more juveniles.
Wow. A couple of questions on the chat. Do you extend your reach to Northern California, especially the Farallon Islands?
No, but we do collaborate with the researchers that are working up there. So there's a group from Stanford and Monterey Bay Aquarium that we're tagging out there. We are primarily working on juveniles, so they were working on adults. And now that there's a nursery up in Santa Cruz, we've been working with Monterey Bay Aquarium doing some tagging up there in the juvenile nursery. But Monterey Bay is kind of segregated, so there's adults in the southern part of Monterey Bay, but the juveniles seem to hang out in Optos, and it might be that Optos water gets a little too warm for the adults. They just don't like it.
And someone wants to know if you have a need or a role for volunteers at the Shark Lab.
Yes, yeah. For our diving, it is the worst diving you'll ever do. It's murky. We're diving in zero vis all the time. There are juvenile white sharks all around you. You can never see them. You'll get creepy dark shadows go over top of you. You just ignore it and pretend like it's not there. And you have to be an AUS diver to dive with us. So that is one of the challenges. But we're always looking for people to help with our education and outreach program. And then occasionally we can take people out tagging, but we usually do that in small boats and it's crowded, but sometimes we can get people out.
Cool. And sounds like someone has an exciting photo to share. Matthew, if you want, you can actually,
yep.
There he goes. He's got a picture that he put in the chat.
Yep. Oh yeah. Where is that?
Yeah, hey, so my name's Matt. Thank you for doing this talk. And yeah, so I spearfish in Palos Verdes. This is at Honeymoon Cove on Sunday. So I noticed that some of those bite marks may be a little bit bigger than the ones on the like towards the face.
Yeah.
As you go towards the back. I don't know if those are getting progressively bigger, or I just wanted to see if you could make a comment on that, and then I had a follow-up question.
Yeah, so the question there really comes down to whether it was a shark that killed it, right? Or whether it was dead and then they're scavenging. So some of those bites probably are scavenging bites, especially the smaller ones. That upper one to the upper part of the abdomen, that looks like a juvenile white shark bite. And there are a couple there that are small enough, and they'll scavenge. The juveniles will scavenge on dead marine mammals because they don't have to catch it themselves, and it's a good meal because there's some fat there. But it's unlikely that a juvenile could take that down. So one of the issues right now with many of the harmful algal blooms that we're having is we are seeing increased mortality of dolphins, sea lions. So there's a lot more free meals out there for these juveniles. But that's a cool shot. If you don't mind sending it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. And then just a follow-up question. So I spearfish quite a bit, and then I was just kind of curious, are the white sharks, are they entering the kelp forest where it's like thick?
Well, not thick. I mean, we see them go through the kelp at Carpentry all the time. Because there's that myth, oh, if you hide in the kelp, you'll be fine. Unless it's like thick, like a diver can't get through, they'll go right through it.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Chris, is one of your receivers at White's Point off Palos Verdes and have a bright orange painted radar reflector on the top?
No, that's not ours.
Okay.
Yeah, our buoys are usually yellow, like a little bell buoy.
Right.
And then, they say Shark Lab on them. But our underwater receivers, we have some surface floats on those, but we try not to mark them because people mess with them and try to pull them up thinking they're a lobster trap or something. So.
So I'll send out the links and your email and stuff, that's okay. And does anyone have any other questions? Come on off mute. Do sharks dream?
The sharks dream. Don't know. Don't know. That's a good question. I don't, if they do exhibit some unihemispheric sleep, then they probably don't, right? Because half their brain is always awake.
Hmm.
But that's a cool question. I would like to think they dream. California.
We just want to thank Dr. Lowe for everything he's doing.
I had no idea how much research was going on. That was amazing. And I love all the handouts and the booth, and I'm so impressed. And the infographics, I'm definitely going to hang in the shop, and for sure.
Absolutely. Well, that's the point. The point is to get the information out. It's all paid for by your tax dollars, by the way. So thank you. And the goal is to make sure that the science gets out to the public in ways that they can understand and appreciate. So that's always been our goal and our mission. We hope to keep it going.
Nice. Question, Tricia, go for it.
Yeah, this is Trisha's husband, Steve. I'm curious what department of the state of California do you get funding from? Do you get Coastal Conservancy dollars or Coastal Commission dollars or Department of Resource?
No.
Really?
Yeah, I asked them for money and they said, we don't fund that. So the money that we got originally was line item money that was put into this year's budget specifically for this, which was great. We saved taxpayers millions of dollars because there was no indirect taken out on that, like a grant. And the university picked up the benefits costs on my employees. So it saved us a lot of money. That's how we got so much done with,
That's good.
with just 3.75 million. You know, those are the big cost savings. So getting state money routed this way enabled us to do a lot more work, a lot cheaper.
I was just wondering about those pop-up demo places that you're actually putting together. How many of those are you going to be putting together?
So we're working our schedule right now. We've got, I think 60 scheduled. So
Wow.
yeah.
Great.
So my challenge is I hire a bunch of undergrads and they work part-time. And because we're running out of money, I'm like really desperate to find more. I promised to hire them. Now I got to find money to pay them through the rest of the summer. And we do special events. So there are times where we have to do 2 shacks a day. Plus we do junior lifeguard training. So then I've got 3 crews going out. So it's great. I mean, our demand has gone way up.
Those sort of public education projects, I mean, the Coastal Conservancy is mandated to fund coastal projects like that, especially specifically for, you know, beach education, as it were.
Right. They pointed me towards Ocean Protection Council.
Oh.
So I'll go back
They
and
have
try.
a huge amount of money.
Yeah. I'll go back and
Really?
try again.
Yeah.
Can't hurt, right?
No, absolutely. Especially if you got something that is, they can automatically see where the dollars go. You stick their name on it, and all of a sudden, you know, it becomes, you know, an identity question, and they can show it to other people, and you know, they actually love doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll hit them again.
What do you think about other places that do shark diving? You know, where they're baiting them sort of in, and do you think it acclimates them, of course, and is that a bad thing? Or is it a way to educate people? Do you think it can be effectively done?
So the simple answer is yes and no. There's been studies done in various places like Hawaii and the Bahamas where they've actually looked at that. And it clearly changes shark behavior. The question is, does it change their behavior in a negative way? So in situations where they provision sharks, like they're giving them full meals, they probably are affecting them in certain ways. And then if you're just chumming, so to speak, you're not really giving them much, but you're using that to attract them to get their attention, that has less impact because you're not provisioning. So Guadalupe is probably the best example, right? And the Mexican government shut it down for 3 reasons. One was the operators kept breaking the rules, making the cage windows bigger, and smaller sharks started showing up out the islands, and they would get into the cage. That was putting people at risk. It was, you know, sharks definitely show up when they hear the boats. They can definitely recognize the boats. And a lot of that started with the sport fishing boats more so than the dive boats, right? So, white sharks were getting free yellowfin tuna that they were stealing off fishermen's lines. So they learned to associate the boat engines, the anchors, all that stuff with those boats. And then the dive operators came in and started taking advantage of that. The other reason why they got shut down was many of the boats had these acoustic anti-fouling systems on them that they use on the big steel hull boats, which actually turns out to affect the hearing and irritates beaked whales. So they actually documented beak whales during the time the boats were there, moving 20 miles away from Guadalupe during the time the boats are there. And then when the boats left, the beak whales came back in. So there were multiple impacts that affected that operation. But in many ways, that place had a great impact on people's opinions about white sharks, right? So there's good and bad that come from that. A lot of people's minds get changed about white sharks after diving in the cages at Guadalupe. But you had to be wealthy enough to afford it.
Well, any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Lowe. Is amazing presentation. Really got a lot out of it. And thank you everyone for showing up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I learned a lot.
Thanks.